But good old Mike Pence, he never even got a single chance to make a first impression. Because the biggest night of Mike Pence's public life, the night that Mike Pence was chosen to be Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate, that same night there was a sudden dramatic coup attempt in Turkey, which is a major American ally, one of the big anchor countries in NATO. And that surprise, bizarre, intense news, that pretty much swallowed up all the other news in the world. And if the Turkish coup itself was dramatic news, which it was, dramatic enough to overshadow the choosing of a vice presidential running mate, I have to say the aftermath of that coup attempt has been even more dramatic. Turkey's president had already been trending autocratic, but after the coup attempt, he started rounding up people, not just by the thousands, but by the tens of thousands. He started building hundreds of new prisons to lock those people up. The guy he blamed more than anybody for the coup attempt was this imam, who is Turkish, but who long ago fled Turkey fearing persecution. He has since become a permanent resident of the United States. He lives in the Poconos, of all places. Turkey's president, after the coup attempt, demanded that the U.S. hand this guy over so he could be dealt with back in Turkey. And while I'm sure Turkey's president feels very strongly about that, this guy is a legal permanent resident of our country now. We don't just hand people over because other countries say so. Other countries don't just get to demand that we hand them over. But interestingly, on election day, on our election day here in the United States in November, we learned in a strange way that somebody who was about to become very, very powerful in this country was apparently totally on board with that demand to hand over that Turkish guy to the Turkish government. On election day this week, on Tuesday, Donald Trump's top military and intelligence advisor wrote an op-ed in The Hill saying, basically, you know what? We should just hand that guy over. He called this imam who's living in the Poconos, quote, a shady Islamic mullah. And he also said this is nice, quote, if he were in reality a moderate, he would not be in exile, nor would he excite the animus of the Turkish president. You know what? Honestly, right now there are 100,000 journalists, judges, professors, mayors, politicians, freaking librarians who have excited the animus of the Turkish president. He's building 174 new prisons to lock up tens of thousands of people who he has rounded up in a gigantic purge since this supposed coup, right? The hand him over guy, the guy who says we should just hand this guy over, he probably deserves it. That's General Mike Flynn, who is Donald Trump's top military and intelligence advisor. He was also today named to the executive committee of Donald Trump's new transition team. That was November 11th. That was the Friday after our U.S. presidential election this past November. That was the day we first learned that Michael Flynn's lobbying firm was on the payroll of the Turkish government. 3 days after the election, and red flags were already going up. But just 1 week later, President-elect Trump announced that, in fact, Mike Flynn would be his national security advisor. At which point, when that announcement happened during our show on the air that night, I went into an extended ad-lib about Mike Flynn. At this point in the show, I had something else that we were going to cover, but I've scrapped it. Because there's a thing I feel like I need to say about the Mike Flynn National Security Advisor announcement. It is an announcement. It's done. All a president-elect or a president ultimately has to do to get a national security advisor is ask somebody and have them say yes. So this Mike Flynn thing is done. That means it will not be discussed all that much compared to the other people who have to go through the Senate confirmation process. But the choice of Mike Flynn really is a different kettle of fish than anything that I think even we might have expected from the Trump campaign. Mike Flynn calls Islam a political ideology hiding behind a religion. Mike Flynn calls Islam a malignant cancer. Mike Flynn really did sit next to Vladimir Putin and take money to go to a gala honoring Russian state television. He's also been a frequent guest on Russian state television and says he sees no difference between Russian state television and, for example, MSNBC. He will now be the closest person to the President of the United States on a day-to-day basis on all foreign policy issues, on all military issues, on all national security issues. And he is way outside anything that anybody on the left, right, or center might consider to be the mainstream, either in thought or temperament in terms of national security issues. And it's done. And Trump gets him unless he has some change of heart or, awakening of conscience about doing something like this for such a key position. I would also say that Mike Flynn has been on the payroll, his intelligence firm has been on the payroll of Turkey, including during the Trump campaign, without him disclosing that while he was working for the Trump campaign. So this is just, I know he's not going to get as much coverage as the other people who have to get confirmed over the next few days, but stick a pin in that. It's a really, really important, really, really worrying announcement. I'm not the kind of person who ever says, I told you so. But imagine somebody else who looks a lot like me, sounds like me, maybe dresses cheap like me, saying, I told you so. Evident trouble with the choice of Mike Flynn to be National Security Advisor came even before the inauguration, came about a week before the inauguration. The Washington Post's David Ignatius, national security columnist, he reported that Mike Flynn had called the Russian ambassador several times on December 29th, which is a key day because that's the day the Obama administration had announced retaliatory measures against Russia for them hacking our election. So Ignatius reports that Flynn had called the ambassador several times that day. That led to several days of Sean Spicer insisting there was no call by Mike Flynn to the Russians on December 29th. And then he said, okay, actually there was a call on the 29th, but it was nothing but holiday pleasantries. And then it was, okay, maybe they talked about a couple of other things, or maybe even they talked about several other things, but definitely, absolutely, it had nothing to do with sanctions. And that explanation held for almost 3 whole weeks until the Washington Post, the Post again, broke that story wide open. And in breaking that story, the Post finally found the answer to something that had been nagging at people ever since the Obama administration had expelled those Russian diplomats and seized those Russian compounds. There had been this nagging question. Why didn't Moscow retaliate when Obama did that? I mean, that's how these things have already worked out. We kick out a whole bunch of their guys, then they kick out a whole bunch of our guys. But at the end of last year, it didn't work that way. Putin didn't respond in kind. Obama took over these long-held Russian compounds in the United States, seized them and took them away from the Russians, kicked out dozens of Russian spies and diplomats, kicked them all out. You would expect Putin to respond exactly tit for tat. Putin responded by doing nothing. It was weird. But then here's where the Washington Post picks up the story. Quote, Putin's muted response took White House officials by surprise. It triggered a search by U.S. spy agencies for clues. One former senior U.S. official tells the Post, quote, something happened in those 24 hours between Obama's announcement and Putin's response. Officials began poring over intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and diplomatic cables. They found evidence that Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and the Russian ambassador to the United States had communicated by text and telephone around the time these sanctions were announced. So we've got U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies bugging the Russians, right? Listening in on this Russian official's calls. And what they hear, according to these multiple and multiply corroborated reports, is the man who's going to go on to be Trump's national security advisor calling the Russian government and essentially telling them, don't worry about these sanctions that the U.S. government is putting on you. He's calling Russia to undermine the sanctions that the Obama administration is putting on Russia for their attack on our presidential election. He reportedly told them, in essence, hey, you know what? Don't bother reacting to these sanctions. Don't worry about it. Once Trump is sworn in, we'll fix it. We'll take care of it. Now, working secretly with a foreign power to undermine the actions of the U.S. government, that's kind of a big deal. I mean, even the Trump folks recognized that somebody doing that would be kind of a big deal. They recognized it enough that they took great pains to deny the heck out of this for weeks now.
The subject matter of sanctions or the actions taken by the Obama administration did not come up in the conversation.
They exchanged logistical information on how to initiate and schedule that call. That was it. Plain and simple.
They did not
discuss anything having to do with the United States' decision to expel diplomats or impose a censure against Russia. I can confirm that those elements were not part of that discussion.
Either the White House spokesman, the White House chief of staff, and the vice president all bluntly lied, knowingly, about Mike Flynn and what he was doing with Russia. Or they lied inadvertently, unknowingly, because they were saying something they thought was true. Because Mike Flynn told them a lie, and they passed it on, thinking it was true. Either way, that can't stand, right? That seems like a big deal for the top people in a brand new administration. That was February 10th of this year, not even a month into the new administration. Less than 4 days later, Mike Flynn was out. Late last night, in the middle of the night, the national security advisor to the president resigned. Was fired? Resigned? Resigned? Was fired? We don't know. But he's out. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. We now know that the Justice Department, including the acting Attorney General Sally Yates, she went to the White House at the end of January. And they informed, she and another senior career justice official informed the White House counsel that Mike Flynn had had contacts with the Russian government that were not only undermining U.S. government sanctions against Russia, these were also contacts that he lied about. And they told the White House that he'd done it. And we now know that the White House knew about that for weeks, and they took no action. Why did they take no action? Why did they continue to let Michael Flynn have the access to the president and the access to classified information that he enjoyed up until the night he was fired? New York Times and the Washington Post have both reported, citing multiple sources, that his contacts with the Russian government didn't start once he was national security advisor. They didn't start once Trump was elected. And they were in the transition period. Both papers report that Mike Flynn was in contact with the Russian government during the campaign, before the election, while Russia was interfering in the U.S. election in multiple ways to try to tip the balance of the election to Donald Trump. Did Mike Flynn help them with that? Did Mike Flynn or anybody else from the Trump campaign collude with the Russian government in their efforts to undermine the U.S. election? It's a very, very, very serious charge. Right now, it's an absolutely unanswered one at this point. That is still an unanswered charge.
It's pretty obvious.
Since Mike Flynn left the White House, he and his businesses and his business associates have reportedly been subpoenaed by a federal grand jury and by congressional committees investigating possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Mike Flynn is reportedly a focus of special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, which is reportedly looking into not only Flynn's Russia contacts, but also his work lobbying for Turkey. Mike Flynn's activities during the presidential campaign, his activities during the transition, his very brief tenure in the White House itself, those have turned out to be right at the center of the ongoing investigations into this new administration and the Russian attack on us last year. 3 days after the presidential election last year, it was November 11th, that we first talked on this show about Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and the possibility that he was being paid to represent the interests of another country other than the United States. November 11th, 3 days after the election, that was the day we learned that Flynn had been on the payroll of the nation of Turkey. And that, presumably, is what explained why Mike Flynn, on Election Day, had published a weird, over-the-top op-ed praising Turkey's authoritarian government. So that all happened right after the election. But it wasn't until 4 months later, long after Flynn had become National Security Advisor and then lost his job as National Security Advisor, it wasn't until months later that he finally filed paperwork to retroactively declare that he had, in fact, been working as an agent of a foreign power while serving the Trump campaign and transition. Now, Mike Flynn may be long gone from the White House now and may be reportedly under all kinds of investigation. But, you know, we never did get a straight answer from the Trump administration about how and why they installed someone as National Security Advisor who really was acting as an unregistered, paid agent of a foreign power. Mike Flynn has finally retroactively registered with the Justice Department as a foreign agent. He's admitted that he took hundreds of thousands of dollars to lobby for the government of Turkey last year, between August and November. But again, this filing is retroactive. It's not like he's filing now to say he's about to start taking money to lobby for the Turkish government. He's filing now to report that he was lobbying for the Turkish government last year, while he was also working for Trump. Now, the White House said today that President Trump had no idea that Mike Flynn was an agent of a foreign government while he was advising the Trump campaign and leading the national security part of the Trump transition, and honestly, while he was sitting in on the presidential daily brief and all of the other things he did as part of the Trump effort. And maybe, amazingly, that's true. That maybe, amazingly, that's true. That President Trump had no idea Mike Flynn was a foreign agent while he was doing that, because maybe the president consumes no news and information that is publicly available to the rest of us. Maybe he didn't notice anything on cable news. Maybe he didn't notice anything on the Daily Caller or Politico or the AP or CNN or Bloomberg or any of it. Just didn't notice. But you know, just a week after we did that big segment that we did on Michael Flynn working for a foreign government, just 1 week after that, Democratic Congressman Elijah Cummings wrote to the Trump transition team to formally alert them to these credible news reports that the top national security advisor to the transition and to the new president was lobbying for Turkish interests. Notification from Congress. And now today, the Associated Press has confirmed that the transition team, beyond the letter from Elijah Cummings, beyond all the news coverage, beyond all the public discussion of this matter, the transition team was formally notified by Mike Flynn's lawyers during the transition that he was on the payroll of a foreign government. Quote, lawyers for Flynn told Trump's transition team that Flynn might need to register as an agent of a foreign power. Even if the president had no access to all of that publicly available information, we know for certain the White House is actually tonight confirming that even if they're still saying the president didn't know, they're confirming that the transition knew. The transition team was informed at the highest levels that Mike Flynn maybe needed to register as a foreign agent. Even if the president somehow was completely immune to this information, the White House confirms the transition knew. The head of the transition was informed. Who is the head of the transition? An incredibly honest-looking gentleman named Mike Pence.
Michael Flynn has filed with the Department of Justice as a foreign agent for making more than $500,000 as a lobbyist, essentially, for Turkey. Your reaction to that, considering that, doesn't that mean, Mr. Vice President, that even if he didn't lie to you about what the Russian ambassador said or didn't say, that you would have had to fire him anyway?
Well, let me say, hearing that story today was the first I heard of it. And I fully support the decision that President Trump made to ask for General Flynn's resignation.
You're disappointed by the story?
The first I heard of it, and I think it is an affirmation of the President's decision to ask General Flynn to resign.
First of all, Bret Bair at Fox, I think, asks the question perfectly, right? He lays it out accurately. Let me get your reaction to this. You know, basically saying, is this not a significant scandal involving General Flynn? How does Mike Pence respond to that? Just play that bit again.
Well, let me say, hearing that story today was the first I heard of it.
That was not actually the question you were asked. But nobody asked when you heard of it. But twice, without being asked when he first heard of this, twice, Mike Pence volunteers that this is all news to him. Never heard this before.
You're disappointed by the story?
The first I heard of it.
It is impossible that this is the first time Mike Pence has heard of it. It's impossible. Mike Pence was the head of the transition. While all of those news stories about Mike Flynn being on the Turkish government's payroll were breaking, he was the head of the transition when Mike Flynn was being vetted for the National Security Advisor job. He was the head of the transition when Congress formally notified the head of the transition that Mike Flynn appears to be on a foreign government's payroll. He was the head of the transition when Mike Flynn's personal lawyers came and told the head of the transition that Mike Flynn maybe needed to register as a foreign agent. And now Mike Pence's explanation for this whole story, inexplicably, is he's never heard any of this.
Let me say, hearing that story today was the first I heard of it.
Yeah, right.
That cannot be true. That cannot be true. That cannot be true. The Mike Flynn scandal in this White House, the inexplicable hiring of Flynn, the secret foreign ties of Flynn, the national security advisor to the President of the United States being forced out of that job just 24 days into the new administration because of his secret foreign ties and contact, all of it. The Mike Flynn matter is astonishing in its own right. But the Mike Flynn matter is also the Mike Pence matter. The vice president's behavior, his account of his own actions around Mike Flynn, these things just don't add up, and they never have. Vice President Pence tends to keep a low profile in this administration, but he really has made a number of blunt, direct, false statements related to the Trump-Russia investigation. He bluntly asserted that the Trump transition had not applied for a security clearance for Mike Flynn's son. They actually had applied for a security clearance for Mike Flynn's son. Mike Pence also bluntly, boldly asserted that James Comey was not fired for anything having to do with the Trump-Russia investigation. The president himself has admitted that is, in fact, exactly why James Comey was fired. Mike Pence has bluntly asserted that there were no Trump campaign contacts with Russian officials during the campaign. That is not true. He has bluntly asserted that he had no idea that Mike Flynn